You think the countryside is harmless until you're the one sitting in a stranger's headlights at midnight, watching a silhouette shape itself in the dust, and realize the world you trusted has been replaced by something that hums with intention. Bright beams, empty fields, the kind of quiet that makes your own breathing feel loud. Those images are the spine of what I'm about to tell you. 3 true stories from the back roads and barns and truck beds of small-town America, each one ordinary at first and then not. I was there for one of them. I know the people in another. And the third, well, that one is the one I still check the back of my truck for when I park. They're all different. They all happen far from the safety nets of streetlights and witnesses. What ties them together is how quickly something casual becomes dangerous. Nails under tires, masked people moving like echoes, someone you used to love showing up to finish a story neither of you expected. These aren't urban legends stitched together to raise hair. They're real. I remember details that make me wince. There are parts I don't know. There are parts I never will. So, let's start on a lonely county road, with a car that rattled, a dream that felt larger than the vehicle carrying it, and the very human assumption that people, however rough, are mostly just people. I was 23, broke enough to make cheap choices a lifestyle, and arrogant enough to pretend the world owed me a standing ovation. The comedy circuit I lived for was a string of basement bars, college open mics, and a dream of getting onto a late-night stage someday. Between sets I took gigs waiting tables, crashing on couches, and making long drives to any club that would let me tell the same joke again. My car was a complaint in motion, an old sedan that coughed when the highway grade went up, a dashboard that glowed like a sad constellation, and a straight-line speed that inspired patience tests. That summer I was driving cross-state to a cluster of tiny towns, dotted like afterthoughts on the map. I had a headliner's optimism in my pocket. 2 sets, a token crowd, a shot for the booking agent to actually remember my name. My phone had the stubborn habit of entering airplane mode in the wrong place. The GPS worked in fits and starts. I'd been on the road since dawn, and by the time the sun started stacking itself low over the corn, my idea of navigation had devolved into looking for any neon that suggested civilization. The road narrowed to 1 lane. Fields rolled away like sewn green blankets. Every 30 minutes a farmhouse stood like a punctuation mark, a porch light, a mailbox with a name I didn't recognize. I remember the smell, warm dust, recently cut hay, motor oil from passing semis. There was a radio station playing country ballads low enough to be a companion rather than a soundtrack. My hands were on the wheel like a little ritual I kept, left thumb rubbing an old burn scar, right fingers tapping the same stupid rhythm as the chorus of the songs. I passed a small cluster of buildings that looked like a main street for an entire county. A gas station, a diner with chrome edges, a bait shop that also sold lottery tickets. A handful of people draped on the porch of the diner watched me in a way that made me feel like I was on display. Not the curious, friendly gaze you imagine when you think small town, but a slow, inspecting look, as if they were weighing whether I belonged to this picture or was somebody else's photograph dropped there by mistake. I shrugged it off. City habit. I'd been looked over my whole life as a younger comic. Scrutiny is part of the job. I made a show of rolling my window down and offering a smile that had more muscle memory than warmth. The clerk at the station looked at me like I'd asked to pay in Monopoly money. A pickup with chrome running boards idled in the lot, driver's door open like an invitation. Nobody spoke to me. Nobody waved me off. The night came early there, like the sun decided it had work the next day. I fueled up, tried to call the club, got voicemail, shrugged again, and drove toward the pins on my paper map. There were early little things. A pair of teenagers standing at the end of a driveway who turned and followed the motion of my car as if they were practicing synchronized staring. A man leaning on the hood of an old Ford who watched me pass and didn't look away. When you travel like I do, you collect odd glances as souvenirs. They're easier to laugh at than to examine. Dusk sank fast. I noticed the first change when the radio fuzzed and then fell silent. The sky above the fields went a color I don't have a good name for, dull blue trying to be black like a bruise. My headlights skittered along fences and telephone poles, and the world shrank to the strip of yellow in front of me. A truck passed, and its headlights were white and startled. With every mile the houses thinned out until the regularity of porches and mailboxes loosened into sprawl. One farmhouse here, a barn there, the occasional pile of junk that looked like a sculpture of someone's regrets. My tires hit something soft, then a thunk that made the steering wheel vibrate like a heartbeat out of time. At first I thought I'd hit a pothole or a small animal. The car didn't pull or sound like a flat, just a weary groan. I coasted to the shoulder and killed the engine. Out in the field, the cicadas were loud enough to make silence impossible. My phone had 3 bars, 30% battery, and an empty ring on the club's voicemail. I got out and walked around the car, the gravel suspiciously crunchy beneath my sneakers. Both front tires were shredded. Flat, shredded nails and thin metal embedded like some weird and very deliberate art project. Small, cruel nails. They lay there, as if someone had scattered them with an artist's care, shining briefly in the twilight. I remember the smell of the rubber under the tires, sharp and hot like a sunburn. My first thought was vandalism. My second was, why here? There was no one around. No porch light faced the road, only the hum of insects and the low, warm smell of the earth. I searched my memory for practical fixes, spare, jack, wrench. The spare was there, wrapped in a bag that had split open years ago. I tried the jack, and it stuttered like it had given up long before I did. I was the kind of broke comedian who assumed resourcefulness could be practiced like a muscle. Tonight, the muscle failed me. I sat on the bumper with my back to the metal and felt the air go colder. Headlights came from behind, bright and too close. A pickup slowed and stopped. The truck's driver, a broad-shouldered man with a flattened cap, stepped out and said, "You need help?" He said it slowly, like he'd rehearsed the question and hated offering it. Behind him, the diner sign flickered on, and a few people leaned out of doors to look. I told him the tires were ruined and asked if he had a jack. He did, and he didn't. He had a jack that claimed to be a jack in some alternate timeline where cars appreciated that sort of thing. We worked under the truck light. He talked about the county fair and which roads were paved and which ones would swallow small cars whole. I said thanks and made a joke about my tour life. He didn't laugh, really. He just grunted agreement. There was a kind of neutral courtesy in stuff like that. No warmth or malice. It calmed me enough to imagine the problem solved. By the time the second man arrived, he pulled up in a bead silver pickup that had the kind of shine, suggesting recent polishing. The sky had folded itself into night. The second man was younger, with a face that might have been friendly in any other context. He moved too fast to be casual. He studied my car like a mechanic reads a manual. He said, "Did you see anyone out here?" I shrugged. "No." He snorted, as if the real answer was obvious. I was thinking about calling a tow when the first truck left and the second truck idled nearby. The young man asked questions about where I was headed, what kind of work I did. Questions I answered in a way meant to be both honest and uninteresting. When you're alone in a place where people seem to catalogue strangers, you practice being forgettable as a survival tactic. And if you've done enough comedy, you learn how to turn bluntness into a shield. When the spare was finally mounted, the second man offered to show me the way back to the main road. I hesitated. I had a feeling that was nothing but common decency wrapped in a helpful bow. I accepted. Maybe that's the last good decision I made that night. His truck was louder than mine and smelled faintly of cigarette and leather. He drove close enough that I could see the map of his knuckles. We followed, headlights cut into the night like knives. At the first intersection he slowed. I remember thinking then that the trees seemed to lean and whisper. He tapped his tail light as if testing for reaction. Then the flash of lights, the same fast white truck I'd seen earlier, came up on the horizon behind us, its beams narrow and precise. The pickup we were following sped up, then swerved. The engine note changed. I had the instinct to speed too, to put distance between me and the sudden glare, but I'd been given directions, and I couldn't simply take them back. The truck in front of me pulled to the shoulder, and then the headlights behind us skidded as that first white pickup forced itself closer. The air tasted like charged metal. When the white truck stopped directly behind us, engines idling, its headlights at a pitch that made the inside of my car feel sterilized, the driver of the truck I was following stepped out again. He laughed, only it wasn't a laugh, not really. It was a sound like a hinge being tested. He walked toward the back of my car with the easy arrogance of someone who believes proximity equals authority. Then something hit the driver's side door, hard, like a fist or a blunt instrument. The truck driver cursed, and the white pickup's driver moved to circle us. For a moment, I thought they were arguing about nothing. Then another sound, nails scraping, the soft, sickening scratch a metal object makes on paint. My stomach dropped in the way it does when you realize there's no humor in a situation. It's a piston of dread. They banged on the hood. They shouted words I didn't understand through the window, a language of threat. The man who'd helped me earlier climbed onto his truck bed and then started toward them, maybe to defend himself, maybe to be useful. In the swirl of headlights he looked suddenly small, like somebody's patched-up toy. A voice leaned into my window so close I tasted tobacco. "You shouldn't be here at this hour," it said. There was no question in it, only a statement with teeth. I tried to be calm. I said, "We were going to head back to the main road." My answer felt threadbare. It didn't stitch anything. One of the men reached toward the car. The helper, my supposed guide, did not stop him. In the mirror, the white truck's taillights made twin rubies. I watched the man's hand close on the metal doorframe like a promise. They slammed on my car. They banged on the windows. They used the kind of language that exists to erase you from your own life for an hour or a night. I thought about honking. I considered driving forward through them. The idea of ramming a pickup at full speed seemed insane. How would that help? And yet the thought of staying parked, of letting them decide my night, felt worse. A sort of small, screaming logic took over. Move or be moved. The passenger side door burst open, and a man with a face like a road sign jumped into the hood of my car and then onto the roof, his weight pitching the vehicle. I slammed the car into drive. The tires, the same tires that had been shredded and replaced, screamed a protest. The engine revved like a caged animal. The man on my roof grabbed the radio antenna and slid down the windshield like someone trying to ride a small, recalcitrant animal. The pickup that had blocked us swerved to follow, its headlights strobing my rear view like searchlights in a drama I hadn't auditioned for. I remember the gravel. I remember the sensation of the car skimming like something that had been made to do other things, being forced into a performance. Dirt flew. The trees became a wall. I veered. I swore I could hear the men shouting, then laughing, then shouting again. My hands were two things with no right to act. The road pinched into a narrower path, lined with scrub and then a copse of thin trees. My car left the road like a fish being plucked from a stream. I hit the shoulder and the car skidded into a ditch. The roof groaned and the world shifted. I saw the silhouette of one man in the headlights. He jumped from the pickup and ran toward my car the way someone runs to knock a window out of a train. Fear took over the rational voice. I opened my door and ran into the darkness. I don't remember how long I ran. There were sticks snapping, my shoes skidding in wet leaves, breath that stung my lungs. At one point I fell and rolled, and there was the sudden, ridiculous awareness that I still smelled like stage makeup and burnt coffee. Branches tore at my jacket. Somewhere behind me, the truck's engine had a moment of furious sound, and then quiet. I found a ditch and crawled into it like a wounded animal. I pressed my back to the cold earth and listened. The night roared with bugs and the rush of my own pulse. For a long time, I thought they would come. For a long time, I decided not to move. The world contracted to a single idea. Do not let them find me. After what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, a beam of light cut across the trees. A figure crouched on the road, shining a flashlight like a questioning eye. "You okay?" the voice said. I wanted to laugh. Instead, I whispered something and crawled toward the road. The man was older than the others who'd been around my car, with a jacket that had seen winter and hands that held the flashlight like they understood what a person looks like when they need help badly. He helped me out and sat me on the hood of his vehicle. He asked my name slowly and then my story with the economy of someone who had lived long enough to know the truth in abbreviated tales. The white pickup was gone. The road was empty. There were no police lights, no circle of angry silhouettes arguing on the shoulder. The stranger, my rescuer, called the sheriff on a radio his truck carried. He drove me back to town and to a small station where a woman at the desk took down notes, and the sheriff, a clipboard man with a mustache like a comma, looked over the report and asked questions I had to answer in small, accurate shards. "You were lucky," he told me in a voice like a man reading instructions. Luck felt thin then, more like an interrupted fate that could have easily run a different course. He wrote down that there had been an incident, that a vehicle had idled by the roadside, that someone had attacked my car. I told him about the nails. I told him about the way they banged on the hood and how one man had been on the roof. He nodded, suspicious of long nights and stranger stories, and wrote down what he needed to write. They took a report. They asked if I wanted to press charges. I answered with the kind of honesty that belongs to someone just emerging from shock. I didn't know if there was anything to press. I didn't know if there were names to attach or someone who would show up in court. The sheriff was sympathetic in the way a man whose job is to balance paperwork and human pain can be. "Sorry, we'll look into it." He suggested a tow, a ride to wherever I thought was safe. I sat in my t-shirt and jeans and thought about where safe might be. The comedian in me had once joked about dying on the road to a bad crowd. There's a difference between laughing at the idea and feeling it converge. I never found out who they were. The sheriff drove me to a motel under a tired neon sign, where I spent the night shaking and counting tire treads in my head. The dollar menu dinner the night had been replaced by the kind of silence that could not be coaxed into conversation. I called friends and left messages that were short and contained none of the jokes that usually made my life livable. I slept in clothes, checked the door, woke up to the neighbor's dog barking and the old refrigerator in the hall cycling on and off. Morning felt like a different country. In the weeks after, I replayed everything, the way the men had moved, the pause when the second truck had slowed, the odd way the helper had not done much when the encounter turned. I went back through my mental map, searching for patterns. I scrolled through local news, posted a vague warning on my social feed, and had a handful of people tell me that the countryside was weird sometimes and not to take it personally. One guy commented that small towns have rules and looks that are meant to test strangers. Someone else joked that I must have been in the wrong hood for my jokes. Very little of that made me feel better. What made me feel worse was how ordinary everything had been before it wasn't. How the evening had started with my usual small annoyances, cold coffee and off-key radio, and ended with someone trying to make my life invisible by breaking rubber and banging on steel. I told the story on stage later that year, because that's what you do when you survive something. It becomes material. I tried to wedge humor into it, to make the audience laugh without realizing they were clutching their own invisible steering wheels. The joke at the end got a few polite chuckles. Humor is a way of making sense of what doesn't. If you're into true horror and you want to hear more stories like this, real ones that stick to the bone, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because the next one is different. It started as a weekend trip and turned into something that feels like a dream, where the heroes forget the script and the villains remember every line. The second story begins with three girls and an abandoned barn that look picturesque by day and obscene by night. It looks like a dare on a map, the kind of place you stop at because it's pretty and because it offers a private kind of danger, the kind we convince ourselves will make for a story later. They were young and in that particular orbit where a broken heart feels like a map and the road looks like a solution. There's a sense of freedom in being nobody's problem for a night, free to laugh too loud, to camp out, to feel the small high of claiming a place that is not claimed by rules. Alyssa was the kind who collected horizons. She had hair that never stayed in one place and a laugh that turned directions toward her. Sarah was the practical one, the friend you text when you don't know where you left your keys. The third, Nina, was quieter, the kind who read more than she spoke and whose face held the serious, ancient look of someone making notes about life. They piled into a car and headed for that barn with the sort of exuberance that leaves you blind to small dangers. Curiosity becomes courage when the music is loud and the road is all invitation. They were on a weekend drive to heal a breakup. The plan was simple. Drive, sleep in the attached farmhouse, tell secrets and not call anyone for a while. The farmhouse was small and sagged like a person who'd had a long life. The barn, though, was a cathedral of weathered wood. Inside it smelled like old hay and metal and a forgotten winter. There were rusted tools and ropes, a ladder that no longer fit its purpose but leaned there like a monument to work long done. To three people looking for anonymity, it was perfect. The girls explored with flashlights, talking in the soft voices of friends, on the edge of a story. They found a closet with old coats, a table with a glass bottle full of something yellow, and a string of photographs nailed to a beam. They joked about haunted houses and gave each other dares. When the sun dipped and the shadows pooled like spilled ink, they decided to stay. The farmhouse had a wood stove and a mattress that smelled like lavender and dust. They made a pact. No late-night phone calls, no prying into old drawers. They brewed instant coffee and laughed until their throats hurt. That's when the small noises began, a tap at a window like someone testing whether the glass contained them, not the other way around. A scrape in the barn that sounded like a finger down a comb. A breath that was not their own. At first they thought it was raccoons or the house settling or the old pipes. These are plausible explanations you cling to because the idea of something else feels like an accusation. Then they noticed shoes in the yard, 3 sets of prints in the soft mud, spaced apart like the rhythm of someone who was studying the house as if memorizing it. The prints led to the back door. Someone, they realized, had been walking around the house in the dark. The girls told each other to breathe. They tried to be rational. Someone knocked at the door. They froze. The knock was not polite. It was precise. The kind of knock meant to see reaction. One of them went to the window and peered out through the crack of a blind. There were 3 people standing in a triangular formation, quiet and still, as if they were part of the night itself. They returned to bed and to the pretense of sleep. For a long time nothing happened, and then, in the small hours, the farmhouse held a sound they had not signed up for. Someone moving through the kitchen softly, the scrape of a chair against the floorboards, the whisper of pages. The 3 girls shared a look that dissolved into the practical. Grab the car keys, don shoes, move. They packed in, a silence that could have been a crime scene. What happened then is where the kind of horror that doesn't show blood gets its claws in. The 3 figures moved through the house not like burglars in a cartoon, but as people who had rehearsed being other people. They carried masks, strange, grotesque masks that fit into the dark like bad memories. One wore a purple cube mask, an angular thing that ate light. Another had a crude cardboard face that suggested the silhouette of some comic book hero. And the third wore a mask with long, icicle-like teeth, a piece of winter affixed to skin. They moved without panicking, like actors in a play where no one had given them lines yet. The mimicry was the worst part. One of them copied voices, echoing the girl's laughter with a delay so precise it became a mockery. They mirrored footsteps, matching the beat of shoes on boards like someone practicing a dance. The house, which had felt safe with its remembered inscriptions, mattress here, stove there, transformed into a stage where the actors had become audience and performer at once. There was chaos then. The girls attempted to lock doors. The masked people were inside in a way that defied doors. Someone mimicked the girl's own voice and called out from a room down the hall. Panic is not cinematic. It's breath in the throat and small, sharp decisions that are more instinct than plan. There was a scuffle near the kitchen table. A bottle shattered. Pepper spray was used, the kind college kids buy with a lime scent, and it made someone cough and scream. The girls ran. They found the car and got in and started the engine like a spell. They left tire tracks in a hurry and revved away, headlights carving a path that felt like escape. They didn't call the police, not right away. Trespassing is a crime with paperwork, and they were teenagers who had just admitted to a shared misjudgment by sleeping in a derelict building. They drove until the farmhouse was a dot and then a memory. They looked in the rearview mirror and swore they saw movement in the barn, a silhouette standing and leaning like someone watching the road until the tail lights winked out. I know people who were there. I know the faces that hold the story in a way that only survivors can. They told me about how, in the months after, the three would wake to noises, would check windows twice before falling asleep, would read their friends' social posts and look for oddities. The fear made them smaller in some ways and more guarded in others. One of them started carrying pepper spray in a pocket she'd never used for anything but loose change. The details that keep the story alive are small and particular. The smell of the barn the next day, a sour hay and oil smell, the way the purple cube mask caught the light in photographs, the way the cardboard Batman's jaw bent like a promise broken. No one ever discovered who those masked people were. No arrests, no grand reveal. Just a pattern of prints in mud and a door left open like a sentence unfinished. There's a type of horror that doesn't resolve. It's the kind that lives in your phone, your dreams, your habit of checking locks twice. The three girls learned that lesson in a way that left them with a palette of new reflexes. They didn't bring the farmhouse up to anyone beyond the close circle of friends. It becomes, in time, the kind of story you tell in fragments at midnight. If that made your skin crawl, wait until you hear the last one. The one that hits closer to home, the one where the person who wanted to hurt someone was someone who once used to hold that person's name like a talisman. That one is the one that changed the way I sleep. But here's where I'll stop for now. The first two stories are true, but they only give you part of the picture. There are motions and consequences that follow. There are nights I still replay when the truck turns into my driveway, and when the girl's farmhouse becomes a scene I can't stop visiting in my head. There are longer shadows ahead in the third story, and it isn't just about being careful on back roads. It's about how people you trust can become the scariest unknown. So keep your pace. The next story isn't just about someone following a truck. It's about plans, love, a ring, and the very specific way normal can collapse into stalking and violence. It's personal. It's crooked like an old nail. It's the one that made me check beneath my truck the way someone checks the back seat of a cab they've just been in. It's the one that I can't tell without feeling the ache in my ankle and the taste of fear that never really washed out. The plan was stupid in the sweetest possible way. I had the ring tucked into the little felt box in my backpack like contraband. The whole trip mapped out like a bad romantic comedy. A few scenic stops, a sunset at a ridge I'd picked because it looked good on a phone camera, a quiet place to get down on one knee and give the speech that would have sounded better in the car than it did from any stage. She deserved a moment that felt intentional. I told myself it would be cinematic. I told myself I could do sincerity without embarrassing both of us. We'd been together long enough that our arguments felt familiar and our silences had routines. Maybe that's why I thought the truck, the open road, the small motel at the end would be safe. We did the van life thing for a night because it was cheaper than a hotel, and it felt like an adventure, me awkward and hopeful, and her rolling her eyes at my playlist. There were small things that misfit like puzzle pieces forced together. She would wake at night if the blinds ruffled. She hated the idea of animals rustling at the edge of a campsite. She said it made her feel watched. We joked about it, and then, over coffee, she told me the kind of stories people tell to be urgent without being alarmed. An ex who left notes, someone who once appeared outside an apartment at 2 in the morning. I filed them away as relationship residue, the way people file away old receipts, necessary, unromantic, not urgent. We camped the first night in the way weekend warriors do, a thin mattress in the back of the truck, a thermos of reheated coffee, a playlist of songs that meant things to both of us. The plan was to ask her the next evening at the Ridge. There was a carefree thing to that decision, confidence or arrogance, I'm not sure which. You can call it optimism that hasn't learned its limits yet. The first odd thing was laughably small. I woke late, reached for my notebook where I always scribbled route notes and joke ideas, and found the page folded differently. Not a big deal. She'd been asleep and moved it, but the pen I kept clipped to the pad was missing. I checked the truck, the pockets of the bed, the console. I told myself I had put it in my pocket and forgotten. She mumbled in her sleep and we went back to quiet. I didn't feel watched yet. I felt only mildly annoyed at myself for misplacing a cheap pen. The next day we pulled into a gas station in a town that felt like it had been colonized by a single theme. Antique diners and gift shops that sold authentic rocks. We ate fries, took pictures on a fake wooden porch, and I pretended the world had rearranged itself to provide a backdrop. When we got back to the truck, the map I'd laid on the dash was folded the way a map gets when someone's thumb has traced routes on it for an hour. The ring was still there. The box was tucked where it had been. The air smelled like rain. I mentioned the pen as if it were an item on a scavenger list. She laughed and said she must have borrowed it to sign a receipt. The laugh didn't fit entirely with the way she looked at the parking lot after she said it, like someone wondering whether a sound had come from a specific side of their head. Over the next day, the things grew in a geometry I'd rather have ignored. A planner she kept under the seat, full of grocery lists, reminders, little scribbles about which movies to watch, was moved 6 inches. A hat hung on the mirror a little lower. The small, stupid things you put down and expect to find in the same place later were shifting like furniture in a house with termites. At first it was the sort of anxiety you excuse, forgetfulness, fatigue, a trick of routine. But we both noticed the footprints. At a rest stop by a river, I walked back from a cigarette and found single boot prints in the mud a few feet from the truck. They were not ours. They weren't fresh enough to have been being made while we were standing there. They were older, the edges already blunted by wind and water. Whoever had been there had stepped in a careful line, as if walking through a gallery so they wouldn't touch the art. A shiver does this weird thing in you. It's somewhere between a thought and a reflex. I mentioned the prints lightly, and she shrugged and said, "Probably hunters." I wanted to believe that. I wanted to keep the script intact. That night, parked near a county campground, the nightmare version of someone's outside began to look less like an idea and more like a plan. I woke to the sound of a whisper, not quite outside but not quite inside either. A breath against the metal roof that sounded like someone rehearsing how to be wind. I sat up and saw the truck's interior glow with a red light coming from a distant tail lamp. My chest tightened. The ring felt heavier in the bag. I didn't want to wake her, so I nudged her shoulder and she blinked awake, eyes like a flashlight beam trying to get oriented. "Did you hear that?" I asked, absurdly hopeful she'd say no. She had that steady look, the one that read me like a headline. Maybe a raccoon. Maybe a stupid raccoon that is also a critic. We lay back down and tried to sleep while the sound of a truck idling in a far lot hummed like a second refrigerator. Eventually, we both dozed in that precarious way couples do when the world outside feels slightly wrong, and the only correction you have is the small radius your bodies create. The next morning, her coffee mug was on the roof. She had set it there while we were packing, a casual resting place. The rim had left a ring of dried coffee and something else, small grains, like grit you scrape from boots. It was nothing and everything. The first time I saw a shadow that couldn't be explained away was a week later. We were parked on a dirt shoulder near a river overlook I wanted to use as part of the proposal route. The place with the lichen-covered stones and the tree that leaned out like a listener. I left for a minute to take pictures of the light. She stayed by the truck reading. When I came back, a sweater I'd left on the dash was folded in a way I didn't recognize, and the pocket where I kept the ring box was flared open, like someone had checked the contents. The ring was still there. I remember the relief as a small, hot thing. It could have been nothing. It could have been me being paranoid. The small things, the folded map, the moved pen, the prints by the river, the coffee mug on the roof, constructed themselves into a shadow of a pattern. I told myself that patterns are how we narrate the world, how we make sense of coincidence by turning it into meaning. I told myself to keep the ring and to keep pretending the rhythm of the road was our rhythm. At night, I slept like someone who believes in probability over fate. Unlikely things happen, and you have the option of calling them a streak of bad luck or a storyline. Then the stalking was no longer a possibility, but a present reality. It started with noise that insisted on having a shape. We were camped at a state park lot with a chain-link fence and the distant bleating of frogs. The truck bed was a small universe of blankets, a bag with extra socks, the ring box folded into a Tupperware container, like the sort of joke you make when you want to protect something fragile from being seen. I woke at some hour when sleep is thin to the smell of someone walking near the truck. Not the wind, not a deer. Human footsteps, a measured pacing, almost patient shuffling that circled us like a dog that won't bark. I rolled over and watched the window. The light from a distant campground lantern peeled across the trees and sometimes cast a dark where nothing was. The footsteps stopped. Then a soft sound at the front of the truck. Something brushed the metal like someone testing whether it was hollow. I opened the door and peered out into the dark. There was nothing. There was everything. My heartbeat was a metronome of decisions. Do I wake her? Do I call the ranger? Do I pretend this is nothing? I did what most people do in moments that later feel foolish. I waited to be sure. The next morning, a small note was tucked under the windshield wiper. It was a scrap paper with 3 words written in uneven letters: nice truck, handsome. My stomach dropped like I'd stepped off wet stone into deep water. She saw it and read it aloud and laughed in a brittle way that had edges. We folded the note and put it in a drawer which, later that day, was pulled open and emptied of its contents. Maps, notes, a postcard with the wrong city name crossed out. Whoever had left the note had come back. Whoever had come back had been inside our things. I called the local sheriff's office and they came out, polite and with the kind of professional distance that makes you feel both safer and still absurd. They took a report. Names, times, a description of the note. They drove the perimeter with lights like sleepy moths and told us it was likely a prankster or a lonely traveler with a weird sense of humor. They said things officers say to balance the human need for immediate justice with the slow logic of evidence. They recommended we camp closer to hostels when we could. They accepted that the note was unnerving. I started sleeping with the cab light on, the way people sleep with a radio to make the room feel occupied. The ring was no longer a romantic secret, but an object I slept with in a pocket near my chest, like armor. The small things accumulated and made a mountain of fear. I began to check under the truck before getting in, the way someone checks a back seat for more literal fears. It felt ridiculous and absolutely necessary. The night it turned violent was one that starts like many others in memory. A long day of driving, a diner meal eaten with hands stained from fries, laughter about nothing, the false luxury of tiredness. We wanted to make camp before dark. The truck was parked in a narrow pull-off near a patch of trees that sheltered a creek. The only light was a dying lamppost and the stars, which always seem less friendly when you notice them. I woke to the sound of movement so close it vibrated through the frame. A breeze? No. Something that was a hand on the metal saying hello in a way that belongs to someone too close. I sat up and felt, with the slow horror of someone realizing their cognitive map has shifted, that the air under the truck was not empty. There was a presence. My brain, which is good at making creepy stories out of static, decided that it would be faster to be right than slow. I crawled out like an animal would, flat against the frame, and looked under. There was nothing at first. Then a dark shape shifted, a shadow that was not the play of branches. A hand, thin, determined, reached out and grabbed at the underside of the truck, and then, in a movement that makes your head try to refuse what it knows, someone lunged out and struck me with a blunt object. It connected with the ankle. The pain was sharp and immediate and stupidly specific, like a page being creased wrong. I felt a breathless, hot shock, and then the world was a single, uncomplicated decision. Move. There was a blade, or the suggestion of one, and a figure who smelled like damp hair and something metallic. I had the odd, rational moment of noting the pattern on the treads of the person's shoes. Triangles, spaced. It's strange what your brain chooses when it's trying to sequence danger. Details are cheap, but sometimes the only currency you have. I kicked. I tried to get up. The object hit me again. Pain made language fall out of favor, so I made sounds instead, stupid animal sounds. I reached for the keys and fumbled, blood beading at my ankle. Nothing gory, nothing cinematic, just a bright, insistent proof of the contact. I remember the feel of the ring box digging into my palm, the tiny absurdity of that domestic object in the middle of something senseless. I got the truck into gear with a leg that felt like it belonged to a different person and slammed the shifter into drive. The truck lurched forward. The person who had been under the truck grabbed at my heel, like someone trying to be part of a story they hadn't rehearsed for. I felt fingers claw at my jeans. I drove. I drove like someone who believes in mechanical escape over moral arguments. The truck left ruts in the side of the pull-off, and then found gravel and then the road. I didn't stop. I didn't check the rear view, because drivers have this instinct that you watch the road ahead, as if looking back will invite pursuit. We pulled into a gas station, where the light felt like a small cathedral. The clerk called 911 because people call 911 at gas stations when the world has disintegrated into a dozen small horrors. They came with a careful speed. I sat on the curb and watched the scene. People were a combination of useful and useless. Some brought towels. One man offered me adrenaline like a vending machine solution. My ankle swelled and formed a private complaint in the shape of a bruise. The sheriff asked questions. Paramedics looked me over and said I was lucky in a way that made luck sound like a flat coin. When the officers traced the footprints, when they asked for descriptions of the assailant, it became a catalogue of small certainties. A woman's size, the cadence of the breath under the truck, the sound when she tried to rise. I remember saying, "She knew where the ring was," and the look that passed between officers, questions without accusation but filled with suspicion. It was then that the name came up in a way that made the world tilt. An ex. A woman I knew in the way exes are known, Faces shared with friends, stories told with a soft shock. She had a history of unpredictability. She had once come to a show and laughed too loud at the wrong time. She had, in other ways, been part of the life that made me who I was then. I don't know what compelled her. I don't know the whole map that led to that night. I only know the patchwork. Years I'd spent with a person who could be loving and surprisingly eerie. A relationship that closed without a clean finish. Messages that turned strange after a breakup. An ex who had retreated into a kind of private hurt that, as I'd later learn, sometimes became very public in its methods. The officers found her not far from the gas station, sitting under the light of a trailer park like someone who had decided to make a bed of bad decisions and then refused to move. When they took her in, she was muttering things that fit like broken verses. She had the sweater I recognized by a frayed cuff. She had the pen I thought I'd lost. She looked at me with a calmness that did not match the chaos. I remember thinking, with an odd Protestant clarity, that people become monsters in the arithmetic of their own feelings sometimes, and that monsters are often the people we once loved. She later told the officers, according to the reports I was given, and the bits the sheriff's deputy let fall into conversation, that she had not meant to kill me, that she had wanted to scare me, to make me see something she believed I had hidden. She told them things that were true and things that were not, the way people who are unraveling stitch together their versions of reality. She admitted to having been there under the truck, to have tried to stop me from leaving. She admitted to bringing something sharp. She described an intention that felt like a weather report for an approaching storm. Not necessarily to end a life, she said, but to change the course of things with a small, irrevocable violence. I later learned she was taken into custody and, as far as I know, was admitted to a psychiatric facility where she would be evaluated and treated. I am deliberately vague here because legal outcomes are slippery and because I was handed only fragments of the paperwork that followed our midnight. The aftermath was bureaucratic and intimate in equal parts. There were statements to file, a security camera footage request that turned up the figure of a woman moving like a shadow, a series of questions from detectives that were exactly the kind of questions you don't want to answer because answering them makes the night feel pat and provable and also real in a way that's too heavy. There were stitches of memory I refused to wear in public. There were people who told me I should press charges, and people who said I should be careful about criminalizing someone who needed help. There were friends who brought food and people who brought quiet. There were jokes I told that night as if humor could sew my skin together. The physical healing was straightforward enough. An ankle that limped for a while, a scar that was mostly a shadow, an inability to run the way I used to. The psychological thing, though, that was a different country. I began to check under the truck every time I parked, the way you check the back seat of a rideshare for a forgotten child. I started noticing the pattern of small things again, a note tucked under a wiper, a pen moved by an unseen thumb. I slept with the phone in my hand more nights than not, ready to call someone, anyone, for reasons that were not especially rational, but were deeply felt. I looked for her online. It's a useless ritual. You type a name and hope for context and get instead a scattershot gallery of photos and rumors and the public-facing fragments of private people. Sometimes there were posts that suggested she had been in and out of treatment. Sometimes there was silence. Social media is a game of ghosts. I found a comment from someone saying she seemed troubled, and another asking that people not judge. It was not cathartic. It was a hole that filled with more holes. Eventually, there were legal steps, statements, a restraining order that felt like a paper wall, a court date that I didn't attend because I realized my presence would have been spectacle without the kind of closure I thought I wanted. She was taken into custody and, as far as I know, institutionalized for a time. I do not know the terms of her treatment. I do not know the measure of her recovery. I do not know how a person goes from lover to outsider to someone who hides under the truck of the person they once claimed as their future. Those are the parts I don't have. And that is important. There are blanks in this story that are crucial, and I will not fill them with guesses. The nights after the attack, I developed an unwelcome intimacy with vigilance. I checked under the truck at rest stops. I learned the rhythm of my own breath and how to pretend I was sleeping. I had recurrent dreams where my truck would fill with water, and I'd have to decide whether to open a door or break a window. Dream logic always brings you to absurd, but tellingly symbolic places. I would wake with my heart a drum and the memory of fingers on my ankle. There are practical lessons that people take away from things like this and pretend they are wisdom. I can tell you to tell someone where you're going, to check your surroundings, to sleep in places with lights and people and cameras. Those are fine. They are not the core thing. The core thing is smaller and crueler. The world contains people who will decide your life matters less than their own story and give themselves permission to act on that. That is not advice. It's an observation about the probability density function of harm. It's not zero, and sometimes it clusters unpredictably. I kept telling the story because telling is how I moved through the night. I told friends over beers and at open mic rooms, where my voice would tremble in the middle because memory is involuntary in ways you can't always edit out on stage. I wrote about it in a journal that looks now like a map of trauma, scrawls and weather reports, and the occasional joke that showed up like an optimistic plant in winter. One element that people always zeroed in on, with a mixture of horror and curiosity, was the ring. I had carried this tiny, hopeful jewel through a near-fatal smallness and left it in a box that had become proof of everything: the intention, the vulnerability, the ordinary domestic thing that made me a target. I did not propose that year. I kept the ring in its box and later gave it to a friend who wanted it for a partner who had a knack for fixing bad habits. That felt fair in a private way. It felt less like giving up and more like reallocating risk. There are behavioral aftershocks. I won't claim to be the same person I was before that night. How could I be? People who have escaped something that looks like an ending carry the exhale of it with them. I carry the memory of a woman I loved, and who loved me in her own ways, collapsing into something that frightened me. I carry a complicated mixture of anger and sorrow, and an uncomfortable, unanswerable pity for someone whose world was so small that the only way she could be seen was through destruction. I carry the knowledge that small towns have forms of loneliness not obvious to tourists, that the countryside can be both a balm and a stage for behavior that grows in empty soil. But the most persistent luggage is the image, simple, domestic and humiliating, that wakes me sometimes, bending under the truck to check nothing, peering into a space formed by metal and shadow. It's a peek behind a curtain that, once told, never pulls back completely. There is a tenderness to that image, too. I am in it, doing the thing people do when they love structure, checking corners, making sure things are okay. It is small, ridiculous, human. When I put all three stories side by side, the tires slashed in a field, the masked figures in a farmhouse, the person you once loved hiding under your vehicle, a pattern shows up that is less about cause and more about condition. Isolation makes ordinary cruelty easier. Distance removes witnesses and introduces the idea that you can be small and therefore invisible. People are unpredictable. Not just dangerous in the lurid sense, but capricious and complicated, capable of cruelty and care in the same breath. The ways we try to protect ourselves: satellite nav, deadbolt, pepper spray, a ring hidden in a box, are all gestures that say, I believe the world will be neutral enough to let me be safe. Sometimes it is, sometimes it is not. I'm not telling you these stories to be sensational. I'm not telling you to be afraid of the countryside or to avoid being generous with strangers. I am telling you because truth is stubborn, and because the small things, the music on the radio, a laugh in a diner, a ring box in a glove compartment, are the things that sometimes stand as evidence that normal things can become uncanny in a blink. The lessons are not neat. They are not a checklist. They are conversations you have with yourself at 3 in the morning, when noise takes shape and you find the things you thought private now feel public. If you take anything from these stories, let it be that life is full of moments that are both ordinary and decisive. Be generous, but prudent. Keep someone informed about where you're going, not as a paranoid ritual, but as a kindness to the people who would worry. Laugh when you can. Carry the thin armor of habit, checking the truck, locking the door, without letting the armor become your whole life. And one last thing, sometimes the scariest images aren't dramatic, they're small. A purple cube mask reflecting light in a barn doorway. The ghost-like rhythm of a truck's headlights tagged to the side of a country road, the imprint of a boot in a muddy riverbank. The thing that lingers with me most often, though, is less cinematic and more domestic. The ring box, a promise that felt so tender and so foolish when I tucked it away. It remains a portrait of hope, and of how fragile that hope can be. If any of this struck a chord, if you've lived something similar or have a story that still makes your chest tighten, share it below. There's a strange comfort in honest company. Subscribe if you want more true stories from the places people assume are quiet. I'll keep telling them because these memories won't let me forget, and maybe, in the telling, we learn how to carry ourselves a little more carefully. I still check beneath my truck sometimes, more out of habit than fear. It's a private ritual, one that feels ridiculous and sacred at once. The last image I want to leave you with is not a scream or a blade, but a simple small scene. A hand, yours, mine, anyone's, sliding into dark metal and finding nothing there, just the cold, ordinary world, waiting to be believed in again. That nothing is a sort of mercy. Keep that mercy close.